What is romantic poetry for? The question's interesting because so much of it seems to be about lacking purpose, contradictory purpose, being idle, being self destructive, palely loitering, listening to your lover's breathing forever, like a sick eagle looking at the sky, or into autumn oozing away. In the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the wedding guest is kind of a surrogate reader. Um, he is compelled, he's held, the mariner hath his will. Hearing the mariner's story should spellbind the reader in the same way it spellbinds the wedding guest. But there's no point to the story, really. It is itself about compulsive, purposeless behavior, shooting the albatross without purpose, and then being redeemed, blessing the stakes equally without purpose, unaware, it just happens. And then the wedding guest wakes up the next morning sadder and wiser, but we're not really told why. And that's all for the sake of not going to a wedding, or that it's for the sake of resisting purpose, resisting maybe the prime purpose of the species, procreation, reproducing the species. The mariner is kind of like a disease, he's going around telling his story to infecting people with his compulsion, his kind of purpose killing compulsion, like the sick rose, his dark secret love undermines the recognizable, purposeful, healthy love. The romantics never thought of themselves as romantic. They only called that in retrospect. The term means purposeless in a way, impractical, imaginary. It's a term of derision, of insult that was directed at it by others, by outsiders. But I wonder if that it's actually a mark of pride, I think you could say the same about a lot of cultural movements. Beat poetry, that's certainly a derogatory term. Beat, means exhausted, worn down, depleted, like emo or punk. They're derogatory terms that even suggest a kind of resistance on the part of outsiders, emphasize the pointlessness of the group in order to resist, to defend against a little bit what the actual appeal might be. It's kind of like we were discussing last week with Dracula. It's like the resistance to Dracula actually enhances his appeal. It's like, a virus. I was talking about it last week in terms of viral spread. It's like you have to invite it in. It's in itself, it's inert, but it's kind of maybe activated by your ambivalent attention to it. What's the point of looking at somebody staring off into the distance? It's almost like the painting's mocking you for, paying attention to it. It's just like staring at the wreck. Like, why pay attention to it's just like refuse. I mean, it's decadent. It's like a squandering of attention. At the same time, it tells us about how our own attention works. For one thing, you notice the different scales of time here. I think all these little details appear, could be blown about in the wind from moment to moment, but then this sort of repeated pattern going off, disappearing into the distance, like the end of Frankenstein. It's kind of like these formations out here. They're repetitions. They're part of the same series, maybe, but like that, you wouldn't see that change for hundreds of years or something. It's telling us something about how we organize time, as is the wreckage, like Ozymandias. It's telling us about the transitoriness of things. Likewise, this too, it's kind of this mix of moving fragments of mist here in the foreground and kind of this unchanging sky in the far distance. Rhythm of attention, it's getting evoked. Sort of a non-subject in a way. It's just an activity more than a subject that we're asked to look at here. And the activity, what is that but what we're doing? So it's kind of, again, like a surrogate audience inside the painting, like all those surrogate readers we've talked about. So the steady, solid distinction between subject and object, painting and viewer, it dissolves into a kind of rhythm, a movement of thinking. Rousseau, the foundational philosopher of Romanticism, this blurring both of time and of identity teaches us something crucial both about nature and civilization. Timeless identity, and especially possessive identity, that's an invention of civilization that doesn't exist in nature. And Rousseau goes further to say that as a consequence also that domination does not exist in nature. There's no time for it in nature. In nature, you just take what you need and move on. Rousseau's famous for the idea of the noble savage, and that image might sound dubious or, again, overly romantic, romanticizing the idea of unspoiled nature. But Rousseau's argument is actually a lot more sophisticated than that image might lead you to believe. Point about nature isn't that, according to Rousseau, isn't that it's peaceful. On the contrary, it's that, as in Darwin, nature is so competitive that there's no time for domination, tyranny, cruelty, or possession at all. Nature is too dynamically interactive, too dynamically competitive from moment to moment. The struggle for survival does not allow for this claim to hold on to things. So Rousseau writes in The Origin of Inequality, I hear it constantly repeated, in a natural state the strong would oppress the weak. But what is meant by oppression? Some, it is said, would violently domineer over others who would groan under servile submission to their caprices. This is what I observe to be the case among us. That's true of civilization, but I don't see how it can be inferred of men in a state of nature, who could not easily be brought to conceive of what we mean by dominion and servitude. One man, it's true, might seize the fruits of which another had gathered, the game he had killed, or the cave he had chosen for shelter. There might be theft, there might be stealing, but the point is then it could always be stolen back. Nobody owns anything enduringly. He continues, how would he ever be able to exact obedience? What ties of dependence could there be among men without possessions? That's not just about, private ownership, but more broadly about our, conception of our identity as something that remains constant across time. Our concepts, the way in which we understand the world, and concepts that don't change. So this is how Rousseau puts it in one of his most famous passages. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. So it's a distorting ideology of possession, a mystification. This mystified belief in property is sort of a foundational conceit of the world we're raised into. And it's quite violent. And it's one of those things that maybe the violence actually makes it harder to question, because it costs so much, it causes so much pain that it makes it all the more difficult to question it because it has had such tremendous costs historically. This is a trivial comparison, but I've heard that said about hazing. That's why hazing works. It's to outsiders, hazing, like in a fraternity, hazing seems totally stupid and pointless. But for insiders, if you go through the hazing and have suffered, it makes you very devoted to the group because you really cling to the idea that it means something. Rousseau underscores the violence here. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes, might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, beware of listening to this impostor. You're undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all and the earth itself to nobody. It's a great way of understanding a lot of romantic writing, romantic poetry, is voicing precisely this beware. You're trapped in an illusion. You're trapped in a false world. So I think the pointlessness is often the point in romantic poetry. This an experience of release from the ideology of ownership and purpose, domination. I think that's what Keats describes in the sonnet. It's sort of looking at the ancient sculptures. Immortality weighs heavily on me like unwilling sleep. There's a deep inertia in his, the weight of his own flesh, like a sick eagle looking at the sky. That's such a powerful image. It's about an image of feeling exiled from your own environment. But if it's a false environment, a violent ideology that you're getting exiled from, it's also a kind of liberation, a gentle luxury to weep. The poem ends evoking rhythms, a kind of abstract, dynamic rhythms. Such dim conceived glories of the brain bring round the heart an undescribable feud. So do these wonders a most dizzy pain that mingles Grecian grandeur with the rude wasting of old time, with a billowy mane, a sun, a shadow of a magnitude. Adding to these abstract rhythms and forms is Keats's use of grammar, switching from the determinate article the to the indeterminate article a. I think this is really powerful for all its abstraction. A sun, a shadow of a magnitude. What is this? Why call it a sun instead of the sun? It would have sounded weird if he just came out and said, like a sick eagle looking at a sky. But that's the work that these sort of abstract formal rhythms have prepared us for this. Fragmentary experience, the a sun, it's a utterly specific fate. A shadow. Everything is you're just dealing with the circumstances that happen to be at hand, rather than the abstract generalizable definition of what those circumstances are. Draws the same contrast here, maybe a little more legibly or accessibly, between two kinds of steadfastness, or two kinds of constancy, eternity. The whole poem virtually is negation. He's saying, I would be like you, bright star, but not in all the ways that claim seems to suggest. He wants to find a permanence in his own mortal body, in complete awareness of the mortality, of the transitoriness of life. in his the movement specifically of his lover's breathing, listening to his lover's breathing, yet still steadfast. Notice the it's multiple repetitions of still, still staying the same, staying constant, but also as a adverb, still in the moment, still going, still happening. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fall and swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live forever, or else swoon to death. What he's saying, and it's acting out of breathing, still, still, and the alliteration of that whole line, the meanings that we normally hold on to, cling to in our mind, get lost in the sheer rhythm of these words. Still, still to hear her tender taken breath. He's evoking a sustained kind of rhythm there, It's that is timeless in its own way, It's its own kind of alternate steadfastness. The of music, being involved in the temporality of a song. It's like being involved in the temporality of a prayer or ritual. It has its own kind of timelessness to it. And death becomes a matter of like swoon, like falling out of that rhythm. La Belle Dame sans Merci is sort of about such a swoon. So what's interesting is it's like the poems we just looked at, although those poems sort of facing down eternity and finding a home in the temporal rhythm of embodied mortal life itself. It's interesting to notice in this poem how many different narrative voices there are. It's like identity splinters. The knight at arms here sets himself up to have his worlds blown apart. And so I think the number of different voices and perspectives here is sort of represents that splintering. So it begins with this disembodied narrator that's just observing this loitering knight and asking why. So that's just an interesting observation right there, Bright Star and the Elgin Marble sonnet are about loitering. They're both about being catatonic in a way, but fully alive in that idleness, fully self-possessed as a mortal body in time. The knight is emphatically not at home, not self-possessed. Again, that's how I read all these different narrative voices. Is his loitering is in a way like overdetermined. He has too much explanation for why he's loitering. He's so little at home. He has such an elaborate story for why. It's pretty interesting. I mean, this poem I find very haunting because it's kind of psychotic. It's like this voice in your head asking you questions in a very ornate way. It reminds me of a David Lynch film, kind of. It's because it's also about a like erotic dispossession. Your identity is so bound up with the object of erotic desire. When that's taken away, it's like your whole self is taken away. The next perspective we get is the fairy. What sort of narrative perspective does she offer? I made a garland for her head and bracelets too and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long, for sidelong would she bend and sing a fairy song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild and manna dew, and sure in language strange she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses for. And there she lulled me to sleep, and there I dreamed, ah, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamt on the cold hillside. I think it's a pregnant ambiguity. Keats very subtly is playing with the question of what she actually says, what she actually communicates. It's this fairy song and sweet moaning. She's all he says is that she speaks in language strange. And I think it's telling that he says, and sure, I'm sure she said, I love thee true. He's trying to convince himself that that's what she said. I'm sure she said it. It's about this question of possession, right? Like trying to pin things down, pin her down in language. Um, he's enraptured with her sweet moans and songs and these gestures of love, um, but wants the possession. He wants the words as a kind of warranty. It's interesting, the pale kings and princes and warriors, doppelgangers of the knight himself. The dream of erotic possession is replaced by um, this nightmare of his rivals telling him that he's been tricked. Ideology underlying the erotic desire is disclosed. The dream of her love is revealed as a matter of rivalry among men. It's kind of pioneering the modern version of the femme fatale, the dangerous woman, which is ultimately, a mirror of male desire, heteronormative male desire, and male fear. The femme fatale represents utter objectification of the woman. But in the best examples of the noir genre, it becomes just a mirror of how this fantasy served, usually a kind of homosocial rivalry, kind of pecking order among men. That's certainly what seems to be happening in La Belle Dame sans Merci is this self-insight on the part of the knight that his defining desire, what makes him feel himself, the desire that defines his self on the deepest level, is getting revealed to him as a generic mechanical rivalry among all these doppelgangers of himself. Doppelgangers that perhaps include the disembodied questioning narrator and as well as the reader, as us. It's like Frankenstein in that way. It's a interlaced male narrators, and it's communicating a kind of male panic at the defining object of desire turned inside out to a like nightmare revelation of one's total lack of selfhood. That oneself, when the sort of a matrix scenario, that's the panic. That this my desire, my sense of myself, was actually just what made me part of a machine. I think that's often the case in noir. That the hero realizes that he usually a part of a machine of desire, that his desire, his pursuit of an individual fate, a fate that would be his own, a desire, a woman that would express himself uniquely. That fantasy precisely is what makes him just a cog, a generic cog in a machine. Blake's Crystal Cabinet is another version of um, this maiden fantasy. Instead of being taken to the elfin grot, he's put in her crystal cabinet. Both are images of poetry in a way, the fantasy of the poem itself. Blake makes that really explicit. Um, he's put in the cabinet, and it just becomes another world. Just like as we read this poem, it's another world inside our world. So there's now the first maid, the her redoubling within the cabinet, and then a second redoubling, which is to say a third maiden, which would be the cabinet within the cabinet. But I think the idea of the threefold is very suggestive, obviously, of the Trinity and of a kind of rhythm of imagination and reality. There's reality, there's the poem, and then there's sort of an ideality, dreams that the fantasies beyond the poem that it evokes. And that's what the crystal cabinet seems to represent, is like the structure of fantasy, structure of reading, rather than possession, a structure of desire. That's what gets broken, and this attempt to seize the inmost form. I think this is what Keats meant by negative capability. When man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. So I think he's describing really precisely that possessiveness, reaching after fact, wanting to hold and own. Negative capability is described rather as a kind of self-loss. In another letter, he talks about the chameleon poet that has no self, that is always absorbed into their poetic productions. Living in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts is about the maintenance of that threefold, of that form of the threefold, keeping that fantasy in the proper distance, not needing to reach after and grab it, turn it into fact and reason. I think a helpful, easy way of thinking about this threefold is just as a kind of pattern of experience. There's what you want, there's what you get, and then there's sort of what you take away from the experience, what you learn, ideals, ambitions, desires, dreams that you continue to chase as you go on to the next experience, the next thing, particular thing you want, and particular thing you get. There's the abiding desire that you're pursuing all the while that maybe gets updated, recognizing it as a kind of dance. You're repeating, going through this sort of threefold waltz movement in life. It's just the dance of experience. I think this is played out really nicely in The Lamb, where it begins with a kind of teacher-student scenario, kind of catechism, the teacher posing like rhetorical questions. Blake subtracts the dogma and leaves just the kind of dance of the pedagogical scenario, but working through the interchangeable positions, lamb and God and child. The conceit of hierarchical distinctions among these categories, God and man and animal, or teacher and student, that becomes an occasion for song rather than confirmation of correct doctrine. Keats plays out this dance of the threefold in his perhaps most famous poem, To Autumn. It's got 3 stanzas. And they play out sort of like 3 stages in a trajectory of desire, anticipation, climax, and kind of post-climactic serenity, kind of impersonal identification with the environment, a loss of self into the atmosphere, hollowed out appreciation for sort of the repetitions of the pattern of desire itself. Let's see. Begins with autumn is characterized as playing a trick, just like we were talking about in La Belle Dame sans Merci. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run. Sort of conspiring to make nature think that summer will never end. Sexualized over plumping and swelling of nature. It gives way in the second stanza to a scene both of kind of climax and a kind of death. The gleaner harvesting suggestion of the cold indifference of death, like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. Shortly before his death, Keats wrote to a friend, "How astonishingly does the chance of leaving the world impress a sense of its natural beauties on us." Wordsworth says that the pleasure of poetry boils down to the pleasure, the arts in general, the pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude and dissimilitude. This pleasure is the great spring of the activity of our minds and their chief feeder. From this principle, the direction of the sexual appetite, all the passions connected with it take their origin. It's the life of our ordinary conversation, and upon the accuracy with which similitude and dissimilitude and similitude are perceived depend our taste and our moral feeling. It's a rhythm of life that I was just talking about. I think that's what Keats is suggesting too. Accentuated appreciation of life is occasioned by acknowledgement of its transitoriness, its difference from eternity, its impermanence. And I think that's what Keats is suggesting here, this sort of steady laden head watching the last oozings hours by hours. It's a incredible image of pleasure, I think, in the sort of a endless climaxing, dissolving in the face of mortality. This gives way in the third stanza to a kind of circumspect reflection, and the rhythm, the endless rhythms of birth and death. Clouds bloom the soft dying day. The wailful choir, the small gnats mourn, borne aloft or sinking as the light wind lives or dies. And full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Hitched crickets sing, and now with treble soft the redbreast whistles from the garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. Sunflower is another beautiful kind of dance of the threefold. It seems to describe a kind of weary, sunflower weary of time, who counteth the steps of the sun, like waiting for the journey to be done. So almost like a desire to for Keats's swoon to death. I want to leave the work of time, but it's about how even death, we can't think about death or communicate about death, infusing it with desire, with imagination. The end of the journey becomes animated, a place of resurrection, where the youth pined away with desire, and the pale virgin shrouded in snow arise from their graves and aspire, where my sunflower wishes to go. Nothing can be finally held steady, fixed, or possessed in an ultimate meaning. To think, to communicate, is to share a kind of contagious passion. This poem about death, the end of the journey, is saturated with desire, seeking, pining, desiring, arising, aspiring, wishing. Byron's Darkness ends in a similar way. It also recalls Frankenstein. The world ends with these two, like Victor and the creature, dying even of their mutual hideousness. And what follows is a pretty amazing description of the end of the journey, that even the suspension of time. Like Blake, he shows even the attempt to evoke the void carries a kind of erotic spark of communication. And there's a resurrection in the form of poetic personification, the personification of the universe. So even thinking of the totally empty universe, we can't help but infuse it with a desire, an imagination. The life of our imagination resurrects it. It's a personified she. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. Personification born of absolute nothingness, the cancellation of everything conceivable. And Allen Ginsberg's Sunflower Sutra makes a similar gesture of resurrecting Blake again, Blake's sunflower, in the midst of kind of a beat down, exhausted, despair, sort of another image of wasted, blasted landscape. Love this first sentence. Again, think of turning waste into communicating passion through waste. It's like eroticized junk, but it's despair. He is beat down. I walked on the banks of the Tin Can Banana Dock and sat down under the huge shade of a Southern Pacific locomotive to look at the sunset over the Box House hills and cry. The crying is virtually taken for granted. It's like an afterthought. Of course, I'm like, who isn't crying? It seems to be the sentiment. Like Byron, although in a totally different key, he's talking about the like chaos of death, of hard clay. All this junk he's describing is, he means to say, what the sunflower isn't. So it's pretty grim. It's kind of pornographic, which is to say precisely de-eroticized, just crap. As in Byron, this complete depletion of meaning, exhaustion, and so on, it underscores the kind of reanimating power of the It's Blake's sunflower, memories of Blake, my visions, form of communication, similitude and dissimilitude. What more could I name? The smoky ashes of some cocked cigar, the cunts of wheelbarrows, and the milky breasts of cars, worn out asses out of chairs and sphincters of dynamos. All these entangled in your mummied roots, and you there standing before me in the sunset, all your glory in your form. That's the point. That form, poor dead flower. When did you forget you were a flower? Did you look at your skin and decide you're an impotent, dirty old locomotive? The ghost of a locomotive? The specter and shade of a once powerful, mad American locomotive? You were never no locomotive, sunflower. You were a sunflower. And you, locomotive, you're a locomotive. Forget me not. So I grabbed up the skeleton-thick sunflower and stuck it at my side like a scepter, and I deliver my sermon to my soul and Jack's soul too, and anyone who'll listen. We're not our skin of grime. We're not dread, bleak, dusty, imageless locomotives. We're golden sunflowers inside, blessed by our own seed and hairy, naked accomplishment bodies growing into the mad black formal sunflowers in the sunset, spied on by our own eyes under the shadow of the mad locomotive riverbank sunset Frisco Hilly tin can evening sit-down vision. And it's beautiful, growing into mad black formal sunflowers in the sunset, just like the youth and the virgin, arising and aspiring where my sunflower wishes to go.